Hello. All right, folks, I'm going to get started. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the start of our 9th week together. 9 whole weeks we've been together. It's been a long time already. We're practically family. But we're not that close because still I have to test you and grade you, and therefore, I can't be biased. So we are well acquainted individuals. Eventually, we can be friends, ideally, but once the semester is over, of course, for now, there is a serious relationship that we share, and that is, of course, me teaching and you learning, and ideally showing me that you are learning something. So we are inching towards the second exam. It's not quite here yet. It's 2 weeks from today. So we'll cover a chapter today. We'll cover a chapter next week. And then the second exam will be the following week. So something to keep in mind. The way I structured the course, again, was meant to avoid, having that exam the day after Halloween. So I wanted at least to avoid that so you guys could enjoy yourselves and not feel like you have to sit at home and learn a bunch of macro right before the exam instead of going out with your buddies and having a good time or whatever it is you choose to do on Halloween. So anyway, the exam is going to be the week after Halloween, just something to keep in mind. We will, of course, meet next Tuesday. We will cover a chapter, and then the ball will be in your court. As far as like a practice exam goes, my plan is to get one done maybe late next week. So you'll at least have it the weekend before the exam. I've got 4 exams I'm giving the week I'm giving your exam, so I need to get all those done on top of making that practice exam for you, which I haven't done yet. So you'll have to forgive me for that, but you should have an understanding of how my exams work. We've done practice problems in class. We'll continue doing some of those as we move through the next 2 chapters that we'll cover. And so that will form a good foundation for you as far as like, where you should be focusing. Also, the homework problems obviously are important. A lot of that can be the basis for the multiple choice. So there's a lot of sources of information available to you. But again, I will have an exam for you ready, a practice exam at late next week, right before the exam, so you have it as a tool to guide you in your studying. But this class should never be about studying practice exams. It should be about studying the material and learning everything we cover, because not only is it useful to you with respect to like what you expect from this class, which is a good grade, but it's useful information about how the world works and how our government works and how the overall economy impacts you. And this is information that you can carry with you throughout your entire lives, and understanding that will just make you feel more confident about your place within this world, as like the crazy forces that are constantly acting upon it are just like erratically moving in random directions. At the very least, you have an idea of how these things can potentially affect you, affect your wealth, affect your job, affect the state of the economy, which can then affect the stability of your overall life. So it's worth it for you to be like really kind of closely paying attention to what it is that we're studying here. And so like with the models that we're looking at and the things that they explain, those models are meant to provide you like the basic intuition that can then allow you to understand, okay, these things are happening in the economy. Let me just use maybe the income expenditure model to figure out, okay, what's going to happen to overall output in the economy, which could then tell me, well, should I expect things to improve or not improve? And therefore, should I expect things to affect me or not? Things of that sort. These things are useful. They're not just things in textbooks. They are meant to sort of help to control a bit of the chaos that we all live in. And so, again, it is worth your time to learn it, not just for the exams. But, again, there are exams in this class, and we have a second one coming up. So hopefully you have been tracking the information that we've been learning, been dialed into it to the extent that you're just going to be reviewing stuff right before the exam rather than learning things right before the exam, which is, again, a recipe for disaster. So make sure that at the very least, maybe during the few days you have now before you wind up having a lot of fun this weekend, you do like spend some time to like seriously get caught up in this course, and so that you'll have that foundation for like the following week. So you won't feel like it is crunch time and you are limited in the amount of time you have to cover these things, which require a lot of time to cover. Like bottom line, if you really truly want to understand what we're covering in this class, it's not something you can just casually get. Like you have to understand all the working parts, all the interconnectivity in order to truly grasp it and do well in the class. Yes? The chapters we've covered so far. So this is 10 we're covering today. Oh no, this is 12. I'm teaching a bunch of courses, so we covered 12 last time. We covered 11, 10 before that, and then 13 next week. So 10 through 13. Yeah, but everything's on the syllabus, so all the information is there. Are there any general questions about anything before I get moving forward with the material? Alrighty. So let us move forward then. So in the second section of the course, we've covered the relationship between savings and investment, and that was chapter 10. And then in chapter 11, we dealt with the relationship between income and expenditure and how the income expenditure model can tell us something about short-run movements in the economy with respect to increasing or decreasing levels of output in the overall economy based on certain forces that might be acting upon that. So we had that model in chapter 11. In chapter 10, we had the loanable funds model that sort of was an abstract representation of all the money that's in an economy that's there to be lent out for everybody that's demanding money. And the intersection of the two winds up establishing an equilibrium interest rate for the economy. And the interest rate in the economy is considered to be like the opportunity cost of consumption. So if you're going to consume as a consumer, if you're going to consume as an investor through investment spending, then what you're not doing with that money is investing it and getting a return on it, which is the interest rate. So again, there's many different types of interest rate. We talked about the 5 major types of assets in chapter 10, and like the financial system and how money is channeled from investors, from savers to investors. And so we talked about all that, but like the interest rate that was set in the loanable funds market, again, if it is higher, then that means that the opportunity cost of spending is higher, and therefore people spend less. And if it is lower, the opportunity cost of spending is lower, and so people spend more. And that's just one sort of intuition into that relationship. We'll be exploring more as we move forward in the course. So today we will be looking at another model that, again, uses a framework of supply and demand, but in this case establishes demand and supply for the entire economy, not just for like a market for loanable funds or like a market for this, that, or the other that we covered in chapter 3. So first we'll cover the aggregate demand side, which again is sort of an abstraction of reality. It's not something that actually exists, or not. There isn't an aggregate demand for everything, but we can say that given the fact that there is a demand for every good, that if you were to aggregate that, then you would wind up sort of coming to this point of like being able to kind of model like the overall behavior of all consumption spending in the economy, all investment spending, all government spending, all the spending of foreigners with respect to imports and exports. And so that's what aggregate demand represents. It represents like this sort of abstract way of kind of capturing all the demand in the economy. And then of course there's aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is the other side of this large market that is basically representative of the entire domestic economy. And so we'll look at that side of this aggregate market that we're looking at, and look at the nature of it, look at the things that shift it, And then we will put them together in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And then we'll get some insights into how the economy functions, both in the short run and in the long run, by exploring some shifts of the two curves due to some varying important forces that may be acting upon either side of the model. And then, of course, we'll do a few practice problems to kind of run you through the paces of just kind of working with the model. So again, in this class, there's a lot of it is about the terminology, but also the tools of macroeconomics. And so that's what these models are. They're the main tools of macroeconomics that are ultimately used by the big institutions that help to sort of monitor and maybe even affect the overall economy to the point where it doesn't fall off a cliff into another Great Depression, and also kind of guide us to a position where at least we're kind of stable and not having dramatic ups and downs, which can be very turbulent, can affect obviously the standard of living of people in general, can be especially painful for people at the very bottom of the economic ladder. And so we there is an active approach to trying to kind of rein in these chaotic forces and control some and create some stability, and that's what the models in macro are about. And that's why it is important to understand the models. But again, you have to understand, this course is an introductory level course, and so what actually goes on at these institutions is a lot more sophisticated. The ideas are the same, but the models are just a lot more complicated because there's a lot more variables involved, and ultimately there's probability involved because there's uncertainty that's incorporated into the models in order to, again, try to control some of the chaos. But like I said at the start of this whole little speech, these models do help to provide you an intuition about what is happening in the economy, even when you're not involved in economics, even when you're not involved in business, even really simply when you are just a person living out in the world, trying to make it, working, etc., and then things are happening in the world that are potentially going to affect you. And so these models can, again, help you to gain insights into those things and provide you some confidence about what could potentially happen, as opposed to just kind of being in the dark about these forces and just kind of being ignorant and feeling victimized by the whole big system that we're all a part of. So worth your time to pay attention here. All right, anything pop up while I made my little speech that you'd like to ask before I move forward? All right, then let us move forward into chapter 12, aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So the last chapter we're going to cover is chapter 13. It's fiscal policy. It has to do with the role that the government plays in the economy, taxing and spending. So we'll look at all the issues related to that. And then beyond chapter 13, beyond this second exam, we'll jump into what's called monetary policy, the policy that is involved in the expansion and contraction of the money supply, which is a major tool of governments, and it can be a bit controversial, but there is a very standard sort of approach that is taken by what are called central banks, these institutions that are part of the government but also not part of the government, but are super powerful, and each country has one, and then the European Union has another one that sort of governs the entire Euro countries. And then there's other financial institutions that work with the central banks that are international that kind of help to sort of even out the overall fluctuations of the entire world economy. So all of that will be covered post the second exam. And so this class does actually wind up getting more and more interesting as we move along. So for those of you that are actually interested in what we're learning, it does become more engaging, especially the monetary stuff. It's really interesting to learn all that stuff because this is behind the scenes type stuff. You can learn it if you want to anytime, the information exists, but nobody's really talking about it all the time. It's a little bit too technical to just constantly be discussing it. So in the media, you won't necessarily hear about it. There are books you could read, but they are relatively technical in nature. So this class is the class that provides you the insights into how all of that works. And it might even create new awarenesses about opportunities that you didn't even know existed that you could wind up taking advantage of in the long term if you want. Like devoting yourself to careers in those fields, because it's actually pretty interesting stuff, like working in those areas of the world. You have a lot of influence over the way things work overall, and if you're into it, then it can be kind of exciting also. So again, that's stuff we'll be covering post the second exam. And today we'll cover this, next week fiscal policy, and then we'll take the exam 2 weeks from today. All right, so what we're going to learn here, we're going to learn how the aggregate demand curve illustrates the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output demanded in the economy. So like in any market, there is a price in this market, and the price in this market is the price level of the economy, right? It's like it's what we've learned about with respect to inflation a few chapters ago, where we talked about what the price level is and how you sort of measure that via the CPI, which is like consumer price index, and how you can have like real values of things, real value of GDP or real value of income by adjusting it for the price level. So here we assume that prices obviously overall are either going up or down, and the intersection of the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand curves are what sort of set that. So again, first we'll talk about the aggregate demand curve, then we'll talk about how the aggregate supply curve illustrates the relationship between the aggregate price level and the aggregate output supplied in the economy. We'll talk about why the aggregate supply curve is different in the short run than in the long run. So if you've taken microeconomics, you've heard short run, long run distinctions before. They're usually dependent on like the definition that's being considered within the context of analysis. So if you took microeconomics, the short run and the long run are somewhat similar, but not really to what we're talking about here. So just keep that in mind. Like these terms are in flux, and they do depend. Their meaning does depend on the context in which they're being discussed. So long run, short run distinction in macro is different than the long run, short run distinction in micro. We'll talk about how the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is used to analyze economic fluctuations. We'll talk about how monetary policy, the policy involved in the contraction and expansion of the money supply, and fiscal policy, the taxing and spending policy of the government, can stabilize the economy. All right, let's discuss first the aggregate demand side of the overall market that is made up of the economy. So whenever there's like something happening in the economy that is causing people to spend less, that is an aggregate demand shock. And that usually causes a shift of the aggregate demand curve. So at any given price level, folks demand less. So in 2008, we had that big crash. Firms stopped spending. They stopped being able to borrow, essentially, because banks became really tight with their money. A lot of people were being laid off. Everybody was nervous. And so that was a demand shock. It caused everybody to stop buying at any given price level. And so that lowered the aggregate demand in the market. So let's talk about what this aggregate demand is. So we can, again, represent the aggregate demand curve as just a straight line that relates a price. In this case, it's the aggregate price level. And the aggregate price level is basically using the GDP deflator to set prices at 2005. So if you remember, the GDP deflator was the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP. And so if you use a base year for the GDP deflator, then nominal GDP is equal to real GDP. And so the base year in this case is 2005. So the index is equal to 100 in 2005. So if the price level is different in other years, then it will either be a greater proportion of 100 or a lower proportion of 100, depending on how prices have changed with respect to prices in 2005. And then the quantity of output, so we're talking about a price in relation to the quantity of a good. In this case, we think about all the goods being produced in the economy. And of course, we call that real GDP. So on the x-axis, we have real GDP, and it's measured in billions of 2005 dollars. And so the aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output demanded by households, businesses, the government, and the rest of the world. So households, the amount demanded is represented by their consumption spending. The amount demanded by businesses is represented by their investment spending. The amount demanded by government is represented as the government spending. And of course, the rest of the world is represented by their demand of our exports. Of course, you have to subtract the amount that we buy from the rest of the world as imports. So it's the difference between our exports and our imports. So the aggregate demand curve represents all of that spending. And again, it is just a downward sloping demand curve. But the reason why it slopes down is not the same reasons as your standard demand curve slopes down in a normal market, because this is not a normal market. This is a sort of an abstraction of every single market in the entire country. And so in a normal market, in that normal market model in chapter 3, you had a downward sloping demand curve because of the law of demand, which said that as prices go up, people demand less, and as prices go down, people demand more of a good. The reasons for aggregate demand being downward sloping are not exactly that. They're related to two different factors that we'll talk about in a second. So again, the aggregate demand curve represents the relationship between varying price levels in the economy and the amount of output that is demanded at that price level. So here we have in 1933, which was like post the 1929 crash, which started the Great Depression. So in 1933, the aggregate price level was at 7.9. So again, that's with 2005 being 100, that makes sense. You're talking about 70 years worth of prices going up. So if we index prices to 100 at 2005, it would make sense that the price level is at 7.9 in 1933. So again, so in 1933, at the end of the 1929 to 1933 recession, we had that price level at 7.9, which corresponded to 716 billions of 2005 dollars worth of real GDP. If the price level had been lower, let's say to 4.2, then the aggregate output demanded would have been 1,000 billion dollars worth of real GDP, which is $1 trillion. So again, that's what the aggregate demand curve represents. It represents the relationship between varying levels of aggregate demand, real GDP, that are demanded at varying price levels. So a movement along the curve represents a movement from one price level to another, and the amount that is demanded at those varying prices. So again, like in the standard market model, the distinction between a movement along the curve versus a shift of the curve is going to be important here. All right, so let's first talk about why the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve, is downward sloping. So recall the basic equation of national income accounting, where we say that GDP is equal to the sum of consumption plus investment spending plus government spending plus the amount of exports minus the amount of imports. So that's our standard national income accounting equation. So if we measure these variables in constant dollars, so again, we fix prices to some base year, then we're looking at real GDP, and thus GDP is the quantity of domestically produced final goods and services demanded during a given period. We can compare varying periods because we assume that prices are not changing, right? So G is, of course, determined by the government. So government policies determine the amount of government spending that occurs. But the rest of the variables, the consumption spending, the investment spending, and the amount that is spent on exports minus imports are determined in the private sector, right? They're determined by us, they're determined by businesses, they're determined by foreigners. So to understand the downward slope of the aggregate demand, we need to understand how the price level affects consumption spending and investment spending, and of course the difference between our exports and our imports. So when we consider movements along the curve, up or down the aggregate demand curve, we're considering a simultaneous change in the prices of all final goods and services. So again, a movement of the overall price level. And there's going to be two main reasons for this to happen. The first is called the wealth effect of a change in the aggregate price level. And the second is called the interest rate effect of a change in the aggregate price level. So the wealth effect and the interest rate effect are the two things that are responsible for us having a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And we're going to consider both of these in turn right now in fine detail, so don't worry if you can't see it too closely yet. So let's consider the first one, the wealth effect. So the wealth in economics is defined as like the value of all savings, right? And the value of all savings can be in a variety of different assets. They don't necessarily just have to be in physical money or in bank accounts. They can be in investments in stocks and bonds and anything that holds some sort of value, any container of value. So the wealth effect of a change in the aggregate price level is the effect on consumer spending caused by the effect of a change in the aggregate price level on the purchasing power of consumers' assets. So if you have a certain amount of assets that are just sitting there, if the price level is going up, then the value of those assets, the ability of those assets to buy things, the real value of those assets is going down. The amount that they will be able to purchase is decreasing in the economy. So as an increase in the aggregate price level, other things equal, reduces the purchasing power of many assets. A fall in the aggregate price level increases the purchasing power of consumers' assets and leads to more consumer demand. So again, so the price level goes down, you have a bunch of assets, they're worth a certain amount, and now they can buy less. So if the price level goes if the price level goes up, that's what happens. If the price level goes down, you have a certain amount of assets, the value of those assets goes up, they can purchase more things, and therefore overall in the economy there is more spending, and vice versa. If the price level goes up, then the purchasing power of the wealth of the economy goes down and people buy less stuff. And so that is one of the reasons why we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So due to the wealth effect, consumer spending falls when the aggregate price level rises, leading to a downward sloping aggregate demand curve and vice versa. So again, here we've got a price level of 7.9, let's say. All of a sudden, there's been deflation in the economy. The price level has gone down to 4.2 from 7.9. That means the value of everybody's wealth has increased. Those assets that are just sitting there can now buy more, and therefore folks are willing to buy more throughout the entire economy, and so the level of real GDP increases, and there is a movement along the aggregate demand curve. All right, so that's the first effect, the wealth effect, responsible for the downward slope of the aggregate demand curve. The second one is the interest rate effect. The interest rate effect is not as clear-cut as the wealth effect. So economists use the term money in its narrowest sense to refer to cash and bank deposits on which people can write checks. We'll talk more about that when we get to the money chapter, which this is chapter 12, 13. So it's the first chapter post the exam. It's going to be on money and banking. So we'll talk about what we consider money and what the money supply is and what the various things are that fall within those categories. All right, so without getting specific about what money actually is in this chapter, we know that people and firms, the firms in the economy, do hold money. So there's a certain amount of money that's generally held to be spent, and it reduces the cost and inconvenience of making transactions by just having cash on hand. You don't have to liquefy a bunch of assets. You don't have to do a bunch of things, so you hold money. So the interest rate effect of a change in the aggregate price level is the effect on consumer and investment spending caused by the effect of a change in the aggregate price level on the purchasing power of consumer and firms' money holdings. So as a result of the price level going up, money loses value. And so therefore, the purchasing power of that money goes down and vice versa. in response to an increase in the aggregate price level, where the purchasing power of actual cash goes down, or money which includes cash, the public tries to increase its money holdings either by borrowing more or by selling assets such as bonds. So firms and households, they have a certain amount of money that they're sitting on. All of a sudden, that money can buy less, and therefore now they want more money in order to be able to purchase the same amounts as before. Again, this is like a cachet meant to sort of lower the inconvenience of like daily or like short-term kind of transactions. So they'll either borrow more money, and therefore there will be an increase in the amount of borrowing that occurs in the economy, or they'll sell assets such as bonds, which are essentially the same thing as borrowing money. If you sell a bond to somebody, that person that buys it is essentially lending you money. The bond is a promise for you to pay them back with some interest. And so again, when these money holdings are just sitting there, lose value because the price level has gone up, then folks will demand more money at any given price level. So then this reduces the funds available for lending to other borrowers and drives up the interest rate. So in order to understand that, we can look at the loanable funds market to identify exactly how that looks. And because of that, this leads to a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So if you remember the loanable funds market from 2 chapters ago, which is still part of this second part of the course, we had the downward sloping demand curve for all the funds that are being borrowed in the economy. We had the upward sloping supply curve for all the funds that are being lent out in the economy. And the intersection of the two sets the price for borrowing in the economy, which is the interest rate. And so let's say that the economy is in equilibrium, and all of a sudden the price level has gone up, and people's money holdings can buy less, and therefore people are now, consumers and investors, firms, are going to want to demand more funds to borrow at any given interest rate, and therefore the loanable funds demand curve will shift to the right, which will increase the interest rate. So an increase in the demand for loanable funds leads to a rise in the equilibrium interest rate. All right, so the price level has gone up. Money holdings have gone down in value. People have now, both firms and individuals, have now demanded more loanable funds. That's increased the demand for loanable funds, which increase the interest rate. Remember, the interest rate is the opportunity cost for consuming and investing. And so when the interest rate goes up, that means that people are less willing to spend and more willing to save. So therefore, they will now, because the price level went up, causing the interest rate to go up, then they will buy less things. And so therefore, there will be a movement along the aggregate demand curve to a lower amount of aggregate demand in the economy. And so this will lead to a movement from maybe this point where you had the price level at 4.2 to this point where the price level has gone up. That corresponds to a lower level of spending in the overall economy. Yeah. Which one? You mean here? No. This is the aggregate supply of loanable funds. So this is all the savings in the economy that are being channeled to people that want to borrow. This is the loanable funds market from chapter 12? So 10, yeah. So again, that is the interest rate effect. And it is a multi-pronged process where, again, the price level goes up, which causes folks to demand more money, which causes the interest rate to go up, which causes the opportunity cost of spending to go up, which means people spend less, and therefore they buy less, and therefore there's a movement along the aggregate demand curve. So again, 2 reasons why we have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. One is the interest rate effect, and one is the wealth effect. All right, so let's talk about the relationship between the aggregate demand curve, and the income expenditure model from the last chapter. So if you remember from the last chapter, we had that relationship between everything that's spent in the economy, everything that's planned to be spent in the economy, and the amount of output that's actually produced in the economy, the real GDP. So recall that one of the assumptions that we made in that model was that the aggregate price level was fixed. So we assumed that prices were not moving in order to not complicate it, in order to be able to simply isolate the nature of short-run movements of the real GDP with respect to the amount of consumption spending and investment spending in the economy. And we had situations where the economy was at an equilibrium, and then something maybe shifted the aggregate expenditure curve, which got us out of equilibrium, which meant that at that level we have produced less than we are spending, and therefore we had so at that point because we didn't produce enough, had to go into our warehouses and take stuff out so people can buy the stuff they want to buy, and therefore we had negative unplanned inventory investment spending that eventually got us to a new equilibrium for the economy. So again, you had this 45-degree line, which represented all the points at which the planned aggregate spending was exactly equal to the amount of GDP. And then we had our planned aggregate expenditure line, which represented all the expenditure in the economy that was planned, and the slope of it was less than 1 because of the marginal propensity to consume. The extra spending that folks are willing to undertake given $1 extra of disposable income, and the marginal propensity to consume is therefore between 0 and 1, and the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save is equal to 1, because if you're not saving, you're spending, and if you're not spending, you're saving. So some portion of that dollar is being spent and the other portion is being saved, and that's what the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save represented. Remember, the planned aggregate expenditure line is made up of consumption spending and investment spending. And like the basis for it was the consumption function, the relationship between the amount of consumption that occurs in the economy and the amount of disposable income. And the slope of that line was the marginal propensity to consume. And therefore, because the planned aggregate expenditure is equal to the consumption function plus planned investment, the slope of the aggregate expenditure line is also the marginal propensity to consume. And it is also less than 1, and that's why you see a flatter line than the 45-degree line that has an exact slope of 1. There's a 1-to-1 relationship between GDP and planned aggregate expenditure along the 45-degree line. So the point at which the aggregate expenditure line hit the 45-degree line represented the equilibrium amount of GDP in that period in the economy. So this is where the economy is originally at. So again, this is all under the assumption that prices are fixed, but we're going to drop the assumption that prices are fixed now. So we can still use the income expenditure model to ask what aggregate spending would be at any given aggregate price level, which is what the aggregate demand curve shows. So we can derive the aggregate demand curve by looking at changes to the equilibrium short-run GDP here due to changes in planned aggregate expenditure that result from changes in the interest rate. So again, the aggregate demand curve is actually derived from the income expenditure model. So as we've seen, changes in the aggregate price level change the level of planned aggregate spending at any given level of real GDP. So if you remember, one of the reasons why planned investment spending would go up and down in the economy was due to the interest rate going up and down, because it is the opportunity cost of investing. And so if the aggregate price level goes up, as we just demonstrated with the loanable funds model, the interest rate goes up and vice versa. So if the price level goes up, this means that the aggregate expenditure curve will shift up. So initially you have some price level that corresponds to this level of GDP, and then because the price level has gone up, which has increased the level of planned investment spending, that has shifted up the planned aggregate expenditure line. and got us to this new equilibrium level for the economy. So that new price level now corresponds to this new equilibrium level of GDP. So then we can track those relationship points that occur as a result of those changes on this model to derive the aggregate demand model. So again, in this case, let's say we're at this equilibrium and all of a sudden prices have gone up. So I'm sorry, prices have gone down in this case. So prices have gone down and the interest rate has gone down, so people are willing to spend more, and therefore the planned aggregate expenditure shifts up. And so at this initial equilibrium, there's this amount of output, but this is the amount that people are spending, and so the difference between the two is unplanned inventory investment spending, and it is negative because we are taking stuff out of our warehouses to meet that shortfall in demand. And so then that gets us to this point here, and then in the next period we produce that much, but when we produce that much we still fall short of how much is spent, and so eventually that gets us back to that equilibrium. All right, so again, here we are at that initial level of planned aggregate expenditure that corresponds to this level of GDP. And so if we look down here at our aggregate demand curve, we see that at that price level, that corresponds to that level of GDP. And again, we say, well, the prices are now going to go down. So if prices go down, that means interest rates go down. That means the opportunity cost of investing goes down. That means people invest more. That means planned investment increases. That means our aggregate expenditure curve shifts up, which gets us to that new equilibrium level of output. And so that's going to correspond to this equilibrium level of output in the aggregate demand curve that is going to be, again, related to that new lower price level. And so shifts of our aggregate demand curve can directly derive the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Yeah.
Interest rates just go up and the price goes down.
Interest rates go up and prices go down. That's just not how it works. Yeah. They work in the same direction. All right, so the aggregate demand curve doesn't replace the income expenditure model. It just is a new way of sort of explaining other parts of the economy or maybe other forces that affect equilibrium GDP in the short run. But it's also this model allows us to look at long run movements that I'll talk about once we get to the combination of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So it's a way to summarize what the income expenditure model says about the effects of changes in the aggregate price level. So by looking at this model and thinking about what happens to aggregate expenditure due to changes in the price level, we can then summarize those effects in our aggregate demand curve. All right, let's talk about shifts of aggregate demand. So again, we know that the curve itself is the relationship between aggregate demand at any given price level, but there might be things that are affecting aggregate demand that are independent of the price level, and thus when that happens, when those effects occur, they will shift the aggregate demand curve at any given price level. So the distinction between shifts of the aggregate demand curve and movements along is the same as in the basic market demand curve introduced in Chapter 3. So in Chapter 3, we talked about like a movement along the aggregate demand curve as a change in quantity demanded versus a shift of the aggregate demand curve, which was versus a shift of the demand curve, which was an increase or decrease in demand. So again, we're going to have those like distinctions as far as how we describe. So we'll talk about a movement along the curve as a movement along the curve, and we'll talk about an increase or a decrease of the aggregate demand as shifts of the curve. So shifts of the aggregate demand curve represent changes in the quantity of goods and services demanded at any given price level. When we talk about an increase in aggregate demand, we mean a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the right, which is what happened just now graphically. And when we talk about a decrease in the aggregate demand, we're talking about a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. So at any given price level, folks are demanding less overall in the economy. At any given price level, folks are demanding more in the overall economy. All right, so let's talk about the things that shift the aggregate demand. There's 5 major things. So the first is changes in expectations. So expectations play a big role in both individual markets and the overall economy. What people expect to happen is going to affect what they're going to do today, which will then affect how things happen overall. So if consumers and firms become more optimistic, meaning that they think that the economy is going to improve over some near period, then at any given price level, they're going to buy more things. There's going to be more consumption spending. There's going to be more investment spending. And so that will cause a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve, and vice versa. If consumers and firms become more pessimistic about the way things are going to work out in the economy, like we saw in 2008, post like the major crash that wiped out a lot of investment banks. People were nervous about what was going to happen, and so at any given price level, folks demanded less, which decreased aggregate demand. So both consumer spending and planned investment spending depend in part on people's expectations about the future. Short-run economic forecasters pay careful attention to surveys of consumer and business sentiment because, again, how people are feeling will ultimately affect the way the economy will turn out. And so there are all sorts of surveys that are done that try to gauge how people are feeling about the economy so we can try to predict what is going to happen, even though that's nearly impossible sometimes. All right, another effect that can change aggregate demand is changes in wealth. So the wealth effect that I talked about that led to that explains the downward sloping relationship of the aggregate demand curve is a wealth effect that's directly related to changes in the price level. If something else is affecting the value of household and investors' wealth, the assets that they're sitting on, if something else is affecting the value of those things, then that's going to cause a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So again, the price level is the only thing that will cause a movement along the aggregate demand curve, and anything else affecting the wealth is going to cause a shift of the entire demand curve. So when the real value of household assets rise, then at any given price level, folks will demand more, and there will be an increase in aggregate demand, meaning the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. And when the real value of household assets falls, then at any given price level, there will be a decrease in aggregate demand, and the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So again, we're talking about the real value of household assets, the purchasing power they embody, leading to an increase or decrease in aggregate spending, depending on what direction that happens. So it can happen because there's a major stock market crash, and all of a sudden, all those stocks and bonds that people own lose significant value, maybe even go down to zero. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something that's going to affect those assets, the assets that are the wealth, the savings of households and firms that are just sitting there, that is independent of the price level. All right, the third effect that can shift the aggregate demand curve is the size of the existing stock of physical capital. So again, physical capital is like the machinery and the buildings and the things that we create to then produce with. So at any given time period, if there's like a small amount of capital, and therefore in the future we know that we'll need more capital to produce, then that will cause an increase in aggregate demand. So when the existing stock of physical capital is relatively small, aggregate demand increases. Or when we have like excess capacity with respect to what we can produce due to having too much physical capital, then at any given price level, the aggregate demand will decrease and the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So firms engage in planned investment spending, as we know, the amount they plan to invest in any given period. If you remember, total investment spending is equal to planned investment spending plus unplanned inventory investment spending from the last chapter. So here we're just talking about their planned investment spending. So the more physical capital they have, the less they will feel they need to add more, and vice versa. All right, the other two effects that will shift aggregate demand are due to government policies. So government policies and government and aggregate demand take two forms. The first is fiscal policy, which is the taxing and spending policy of the economy. So an increase in government purchases shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and a decrease shifts it to the left. So let's say there's a war all of a sudden. That means that the government needs to spend a lot more money on the military and fighting the enemy or whatever. So at any given price level, aggregate demand will increase to the right as the government spends more. If the government lowers taxes across the board, then disposable income goes up. Disposable income is the difference between income and taxes plus transfers. Transfers, again, being payments that the government makes to households, such as like welfare payments, Social Security, unemployment, things of that sort. So disposable income is equal to income plus transfers minus taxes. When taxes go down, disposable income goes up. So at any given price level, folks demand more, and that increases aggregate demand, and vice versa. So fiscal policy, one of the things that can shift aggregate demand. And then, of course, there's the other policy tool that the government has to affect the economy, and that is monetary policy. So monetary policy, again, has to do with the expansion and the contraction of the money supply in the economy. In modern economies, the quantity of money in circulation is largely determined by the decisions of a central bank created by the government. When the central bank increases the quantity of money in circulation, households and firms have more money, which they are willing then to lend out. And so the supply of loanable funds then increases. The effect is to drive the interest rate down at any given aggregate price level, leading to higher investment spending and higher consumer spending. So that's what happens when the money supply increases. It drives the interest rate down, and it lowers the opportunity cost of spending, and so people spend more. So again, here's our loanable funds market. The central bank has increased the money supply, which means that now there's more money in the economy, which means that the supply of savings increases, and therefore the loanable fund supply, the amount of funds that are available to be lent out, increases in the economy, which leads to an equilibrium interest rate that is lower. A fall in the equilibrium interest rate, and again, that means that the opportunity cost of spending has now gone down. People spend more. So that is why monetary policy that is expansionary, that will expand the money supply, will shift aggregate demand to the right. And when the money supply is contracted, that will shift aggregate supply to the left. Aggregate demand to the left, sorry. All right, now let's talk about aggregate supply, the other side of this market, this huge, abstract, not real, but summation of all markets in the economy. Again, there's demand in every market and there's supply in every market. So let's look at the total supply in the market, which is represented by the aggregate supply curve, which shows the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output supplied in the economy. So in this case, it's going to be upward sloping, like any supply curve is. But the supply curve that we consider is not just an aggregate supply curve, but it is the short-run aggregate supply curve. And we'll talk about the long-run aggregate supply curve towards the end of the lecture. But the short-run aggregate supply curve is what we see here. It's an upward sloping curve that relates higher levels of the price level to higher levels of GDP and lower levels of the price level to lower levels of GDP. So in the period from 1929 to 1933, we got some solid evidence that there is a positive relationship between the price level and the amount of aggregate supply. In 1929, the price level was at 9.9. And of course, that's when we had the stock market crash, which led to the Great Depression. And when that happened, obviously there was a lot less output in the economy. There were a lot less jobs. That means GDP shrunk. And so that caused prices to go down. And so by 1933, it did go down to 7.3, the price level, which corresponded to a much lower level of real GDP, a decrease of about a quarter. So that clearly demonstrates the positive relationship between the price level and GDP. As the price level goes up, aggregate supply goes up, and as the price level goes down, aggregate supply goes down. And of course, that represents a movement along the short run aggregate supply curve, which leads to deflation, prices going down, and lower aggregate output. So the reason why the supply curve is positively sloped the way it is less complicated than the reason why the demand curve is negatively sloped. Again, that is due to the wealth effect and the interest rate effect. So remember, for a producer, their profits, and profits in economics are generally denoted by the symbol pi. So the firm's profits for a unit sold are defined as the price sold minus the cost to produce a given unit. At any given point in time, many of the costs producers face are fixed per unit of output. So the largest source of inflexible production costs is the wages paid to workers. That is the one source. That is the one sort of cost that is moving, that is variable, that affects producers' abilities to supply at any given quantity they want to supply at. So this one price of the variable input, the labor, is what we call the nominal wage, the dollar amount of the wage paid. We call it the nominal wage because we also talk about the real wage here, which is the wage adjusted for inflation, so adjusted for the price level. Wages are typically inflexible production costs because the nominal wage is set by long-term contracts. So workers go into a work situation and their wages are set for an extended period of time, and therefore it's not easy for wages to go up and down. And even if there aren't long-term formal contracts between management and workers, there are informal agreements that make companies reluctant to change wages in response to economic conditions. So we have, therefore, what are called sticky wages, which are nominal wages that are slow to fall even in the face of high unemployment and slow to rise even in the face of labor shortages. So that's going to be a source for fluctuations in the economy around the output level that the economy is always kind of trying to go to. The fact that wages are not easily moving with respect to the things that are happening in the economy sort of create some larger conditions for the overall ability of the economy to adjust properly to changes in the price level, which is what will establish the short run versus the long run distinction. So how long it takes for the nominal wages to become flexible is an integral component of what distinguishes the short run from the long run here. The responses of firms in perfectly competitive industries and those of firms in imperfectly competitive industries lead to an upward sloping relationship between aggregate output and the aggregate price level. So again, we're talking about here perfectly competitive industries and imperfectly competitive industries. Those are terms that basically reflect the competitive nature of the industry. In a perfectly competitive industry, you have as much competition as you possibly can. There's a bunch of firms. Nobody can really affect the price. But in imperfectly competitive markets, there's not that much competition. You might have just one firm dominating the market, or you might have a few large firms dominating the market, which is called an oligopoly. So regardless of what kind of industry it is, all the firms, whenever the prices are changing, have to adjust the amount of output because the prices of their inputs can't be adjusted easily in order to reflect changes in the overall price level, because wages are sticky. And therefore, when the price level goes up, they supply more. When the price level goes down, they supply less. So again, profit is the difference between the price a unit is sold at minus the cost to produce it. So if the price goes down, then profits go down. And if the price goes up, then profits go up, because the cost to produce is not changing because wages are sticky. All right, we'll talk more about how that affects short run versus long run when we finally get to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So let's talk about things that will shift the short run aggregate supply curve. So a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve is a decrease in the short run aggregate supply curve. And a rightward shift of the short run aggregate supply curve is an increase in the short run aggregate supply curve. And the things that will shift them are as follows. So the first thing that will shift the aggregate supply is going to be changes in commodity prices. So commodities are like very generic goods that are generally used as inputs into production. So like things like oil or like steel, like these very generic goods that are bought in large quantities that most industries are dependent upon. If the price of those things is either going up or going down, then that's going to mean that at any given price level, all firms in the economy are either going to supply more or less. So if you think about oil, let's just talk specifically about oil. The price of oil has gone up. So if the price of oil goes up, then at any given price level, firms are going to now supply less because a major input into their production has now increased in price, and that's caused the cost of supplying a given quantity to increase. And so that will decrease the short run aggregate supply curve. And if the oil prices go down, you'll have the opposite effect. The short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Aggregate supply will increase under those circumstances. So again, a rise in the price of an input leads to a more expensive production process, resulting in a leftward shift of aggregate supply and vice versa. All right. Something else that will shift the aggregate supply curve, and that is changes in nominal wages. Even though wages are sticky in the short run, they will not change easily, even if all prices in the economy are changing because of long-term contracts. Those long-term contracts eventually expire, and when they do, nominal wages will adjust. And so if nominal wages go up, then at any given price level, that means that the production costs go up. That means firms are willing to supply less. And so short-run aggregate supply will shift to the left and vice versa. So again, nominal wages can change once enough time has passed for contracts and informal agreements to be renegotiated. And so that will be a shifter of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Another factor that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve is changes in productivity. So we talked about productivity in the last chapter before the first exam. We looked at that aggregate production function that represented all the production in the economy as a function of labor productivity. And whenever we had one of three different effects, increasing our ability to produce a given quantity at any given labor productivity, then we were able to produce more, which means that if that happens, then we are able to produce more at a lower price, which then increases aggregate supply. And if the opposite happens, vice versa. So an increase in productivity means that a worker can produce more units of output with the same quantity of inputs. So when workers become more productive, aggregate supply increases, and when workers become less productive, aggregate supply decreases. This increases producers' profits and shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve either to the left or to the right. So remember, again, just looking at this production function from, I think it was chapter 9. Again, the aggregate production function was a hypothetical function that shows how productivity, real GDP per worker, depends on the quantity of physical capital per worker, human capital per worker, as well as the state of technology. So if any of those three things change, either the amount of physical capital in the economy, that will increase our total factor productivity. So at any given level of physical capital per worker, our real GDP would increase. Another thing that could increase that is an increase in human capital, which again is like knowledge, skills, education, things that people are able to cultivate via education that then makes them more productive at any given level of capital per worker, and therefore that increases total factor productivity. And then the third thing was the state of technology. So as we know, like we've had several industrial revolutions, including the one that just occurred in the last 30 years, and that also increased total factor productivity. So again, that leads to lower costs of production at any given price level, which means that firms are willing to supply more at any given price level overall in the economy. So aggregate supply increases as a result of an increase in total factor productivity. All right, now let's talk about this long run aggregate supply curve. So in the long run, nominal wages, like the aggregate price level, are flexible and not sticky. So the result is that in the long run, the aggregate price level has no effect on the quantity of aggregate output supplied, and therefore the long run aggregate supply curve is just a vertical line at a level of real GDP. So that means that the level of real GDP in the long run is unaffected by the price level in the economy. So when prices and costs of production all move up or down by the same proportion, then aggregate output remains unchanged. So the thing that will shift this long run aggregate output has to do with just the overall ability of the economy to produce, the long run economic growth that we talked about in, I think it was chapter 9. Since in reality it's difficult for these price changes to occur at once for all prices in the economy to change, including wages, which are sticky in the short run, the period of time over which all prices are fully flexible is therefore the long run. So that is what we consider the long run here in macroeconomics. The period in which all prices are fully flexible, including nominal wages, which are sticky in the short run, which is what defines the macroeconomic short run. So the long run aggregate supply curve shows the relationship between the aggregate price level and the quantity of aggregate output supplied that would exist if all prices, including nominal wages, were fully flexible. The long run aggregate supply position along the horizontal axis represents a significant measure. It represents what's called potential output. So this level of output, corresponding to the long run, is the level of real GDP that the economy would produce if all prices, including nominal wages, were fully flexible. So if you remember, there was also, when we talked about unemployment, there was a natural rate of unemployment, and that natural rate of unemployment was made up of the structural and the frictional unemployment, which was independent of the cyclical unemployment, which had to do with deviations of unemployment from that natural state, in which the economy was either doing more than it should be doing or less than it should be doing. And that natural rate of unemployment represented the amount of unemployment that was natural for like a steady state for the economy. So that's also what this potential output represents. It represents sort of like a steady point for the economy that the economy is always trying to get to. And if we're doing more than that, then we are heating up, meaning the economy is doing too much and prices are going to be going up. And if we're at an output level below that, then we are at a point where there's just not enough being produced in the economy. The economy could be doing better. We are underusing some of our resources, and it's problematic. So an economy's potential output is an important number because it defines a trend around which actual aggregate output fluctuates from year to year. In the United States, the Congressional Budget Office estimates annual potential output for the purposes of federal budget analysis. So here we've got potential output being this orange line here. This is a time series from 1990 all the way to 2014. And then we've got this blue line that represents the movements of the actual output around our potential output. And we see that potential output is increasing over time. As we know, the amount of that the economy can produce does do over time. There's economic growth, which increases our ability to produce over time. So in the figure, years shaded in purple represent, on the horizontal axis, correspond to periods in which the aggregate output fell short of potential output. So these are periods in which we're producing less than what we could be producing. So 91 through 95, there was a recession during that time. In the early 2000s, there was a recession there too. And of course, post 2008, there was a major recession. So we see that the actual aggregate output was quite less than the potential output during those periods. And then, of course, the green periods represent periods in which we're doing better than potential output. And we had a small period in 1990 there, then some during the 90s, during the digital boom, the dot-com boom. And then we also had some prosperity in the 2000s, again, due to the digital revolution. And then, obviously, we haven't experienced that for a while. So U.S. potential output has risen steadily over time, implying a series of rightward shifts of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So the fact that this is moving over time means that that long-run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right over time. So let's talk about the movement from the short run to the long run, and then we'll take a break. So if the economy is on the short run but not the long run aggregate supply curve, the short run aggregate supply curve will shift over time until the economy is at a point where both curves cross, a point where actual aggregate output is equal to potential output. So in this figure, the economy is producing more than potential output. So here's the short run aggregate supply curve. We're currently at this point here, corresponding to this price level and this level of output. We see that the long run aggregate supply curve is at this level of potential GDP, and therefore we're at a point where the economy is producing more than potential GDP. This is possible only because nominal wages haven't yet fully adjusted upward. When those wages finally do adjust upward, that means that at any given price level, the cost of producing is going to go up for firms. That means that they will supply less. That means that there will be a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve, and therefore the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left and get us to that point where it is on the short-run aggregate supply curve, and we are at potential output. So in this figure, the economy is producing less than potential output. So here's our short-run aggregate supply curve. We are producing at this point here, at this price level. Here's our output level. Here's our long-run aggregate supply at this level of potential GDP. This is possible only because nominal wages haven't yet fully adjusted downward. So in this case, nominal wages are a little bit high. Prices have gone down in the economy from the long-run equilibrium, but wages are sticky. They have not adjusted as a result of long-term contracts. But eventually those contracts expire. When the wages go down at any given price level, firms incur less costs to produce. That means that aggregate supply will shift to the right, and we will get to the point where our economy is back at potential output. So we'll shortly see that these shifts of the short-run aggregate supply curve will return the economy to potential output in the long run. When we throw in the aggregate demand curve in there, it'll be a lot better to understand why things are happening the way they are. But that's just meant to sort of establish the nature of the short-run versus the long-run aggregate supply equilibriums. All right, let's take a break. Let's come back at 35, and we will continue with the second part of the lecture.